As soon as I visited these rooms, I knew I was going to make an exhibition that is very quiet and that offers a limited amount of things to focus on. So all the works work together in concert. That said, each room kind of has a particular feeling the way it's installed. So two works on one pedestal are kind of in a way communicating with each other, but then with this other pedestal as well. Sometimes it's one piece of wood and sometimes it's pieces sculpted together, but part of the thing that I've realized that I like about this way of working is that I read somewhere that in nature, there's not very much space between things, so that your pancreas is on top of your liver like this, or whatever is underneath your pancreas. I don't know actually, but there's not much air between things. And part of the reason why things look soft or natural is because they grow together. And so often when I make a work that's made from one single piece of wood, when I cut the parts apart, they go back together perfectly. There are several works in this show that I actually had to sculpt by hand from different pieces of wood to make them appear this way, which is much more difficult technically. I also consider that a side effect of that the sculptures come from drawing, because this is also a quality of drawing, that when you draw one line and then you draw another line next to it and another line next to that, it's as if those two objects that you just created with those three lines are on top of each other perfectly. The process is almost 100% started with automatic drawing, meaning it's less likely that it's contaminated by my will, things that actually maybe don't totally make sense or are impossible to sculpt. All these things that I've found over the years are important to get to new layers of language, because there's so much practicality involved in sculpting something. You're working with dangerous tools and there's a limit to the material, but in drawing, so many things can happen fairly quickly. For that reason, I've really been faithful to drawing first and sculpting later. And also, in fact, the part of the vocabulary of the sculpture is my loyalty to the drawing and all of its faults, its perspectival faults, its textural faults, or its attributes of texture. And so sometimes I may be using the side of a piece of charcoal, but then I try to figure out, well, how am I going to replicate this texture in wood? This kind of erasing mark does like become something like transparent. In this show, for example, there's a couple of pieces of plastic that were actually marks that were erased from charcoal, or there's one object that's lacquered, and the lacquer was because of the way that I had drawn this certain object that I decided it must be glossy. There are lots of different kinds of objects that lead you to contemplation in a lot of different ways. One of the most exciting ways to contemplate something is to be completely unsure on which way you're going to feel about it. This is one of the things that brought me to abstraction. Somehow there's more slippage with the abstraction. You can't fully rely on each part that you're seeing. You can't decode it. There's a quality in these things that feels as if they're creatures, aliens. And sometimes there are aliens among our own species, you know, someone who in the most beautiful way looks different. Or if you're, let's say, like a mile or two underneath the water, you're seeing some very fantastical organisms that you could never believe existed, or even understand why they look the way they look. But because it's natural, you accept it, and you're almost in wonder of how things became the way they did. A mushroom that glows, or or a lizard that changes colors, or a strange sponge that's just a whole bunch of like vertical strings, all these weird things. These are the things that really inspire me, and I think that many of the works feel that they are alive and that they have consciousness, and that somehow the nature of their being then creates psychology. I'm looking at a series of objects, but something is kind of happening, but it's not quite a narrative. One object may be pushing energy into another object. The work is called Trophallaxics. When I was working on that work, I realized like these two forms are communicating like in the same way that like an older animal, like a mother bird, chews food and then throws it up into a baby bird. And there's something kind of strange about this, but it's also love. You may not be able to walk away from it saying like, oh, well, this work is about love, but maybe intuitively it hits you here instead of up here. There's some sort of weird something with that for me. I think that's what makes me feel grateful to be able to spend hours and hours and hours every, day, week, month, year, like committed to just making my unconscious into something palpable.